Architectural Outcast.
Randy here from the Architectural Outcast. I want to talk to y'all about environmental mistakes in world building, both mistakes in the physical environment and the social cultural environment. Architecture is heavily influenced by its environment, by its specific geography, weather conditions, temperature, and what local materials are readily available to build the architecture. All architecture also exists within a social cultural environment. Why was the architecture, whether we be talking a specific building or a whole city, put on that specific spot? What function does it serve? And how does the architecture reflect the social cultural needs of the people who built and used the architecture? The relationship between architecture and environment is the foundation of architectural symbolism. Just by looking at the architecture, it should communicate to you the environment it comes from, both physical and social cultural. Humans have been interacting with the built world for thousands of years. We have an almost intuitive understanding of the relationship between architecture and its environment, which causes us to have preconceived ideas, expectations. Whenever we encounter an architecture that doesn't fulfill those expectations, we have cognitive dissonance. We have a mental double take, which is not good for world building. Bethesda very clearly understands this relationship between architecture and its environment because there are times they do a very good job of fulfilling players' expectations. For example, Anvil. The map tells us that Anvil's located on the coast in a bay near the mouth of a major river. All indicators that this city should be a port, a major trading and economic hub. When we get to Anvil, what do we discover? It's in a small sheltered valley on a dry, rocky, windswept coast. Not only is Anvil a port, everything about the city reinforces the importance of that port. For example, the city's defenses, the castle, the city walls, emphasize defending the port to the point that they almost ignore the landside defenses. And then there's the city's materiality. It's made primarily out of stone, which makes sense on a rocky, windswept coast. The city of Anvil, its architecture matches its environment. It fulfills our expectations. Based upon its location, we assume it would be a port. We find it's a port. Its architecture is focused on that port, including its defenses, and its materiality matches its environment. And then there's Leyawiin.
Wah, wah, wah.
Leyawiin is the southernmost city in Cyrodiil and is in the part of the province that sticks down between Elsewhere and Black Marsh. Leyawiin sits at the mouth of the lower Niben River where it runs into Topol Bay. The Niben runs past Bravil all the way up to Imperial City. Looking closely at the map, we see that Leyawiin is located on a particularly narrow point in the Niben, allowing the city to control access into the river. The geography is telling us that not only is Leyawiin a port, it's an important strategic military city as well. However, when you make it down to Leyawiin, you discover the lower Niben is blocked. The lower Niben doesn't have an outlet to the ocean. My first question, where does all the water coming down the Niben go? This little strip of land acts like a dam. If the water doesn't have a way to get to the ocean, it should be flooding this area. Y'all could make the argument this is another example of an empire in decline. For whatever reason, corruption, incompetence, lack of will, they're no longer dredging the river properly. It's silting up. In of itself, this sounds like a reasonable argument until you realize they built a road over this piece of land dividing the Niben. The same old, dilapidated road as the rest of Cyrodiil, indicating this road, thus this piece of land, has been here for a long time. The decision to put this little strip of land where it's at, blocking the Niben with its old road across it, opens up a whole can of worms. not the least of which Leyawiin no longer has a reason to exist. The first problem is a relatively small problem in the grand scheme of things, but it's this inattention to detail that always gets ya. Up in Imperial City Harbor, there are ocean-going ships. According to the map, the only way these ocean-going ships can get to Imperial City is by coming up the Nibbin, past Leyawiin. But the Nibbin's blocked. So where in the blue blazes do those ocean-going ships up in Imperial City come from? Bigger problem? Leyawiin doesn't have a port. There's space for one, it's just not there. Well, that's not completely accurate. It is true that there aren't any docks on the ocean side of Leyawiin, but there are docks on the Nibbin side, if you want to call this a dock. Without a port, the only other reason why Leyawiin could exist is to control access up and down the Nibbin. But again, we have this strip of land with the road across it blocking the Nibbin. Therefore, we're back to the question, why does Leyawiin exist in the first place? The next big problem are Leyawiin's walls. Not only do they not fit the environment, fit our expectations of what they should be in this particular environment, they actively go against our expectations. They go against the environment. Not only does Leyawiin not have a port, it doesn't even have a gate on the ocean side of the city. In fact, it turns its back on the ocean. While the city does have its castle on the river side, it also doesn't even bother to have a gate facing the Nibbin. With the two main northeast gates, one is aimed north back into Cyrodiil, and the other one is actually aimed back at the path going over the dam across the Nibbin. The only other gate, the west gate, along with the only stable, faces off into nowhere. Yeah, I know technically it faces off into the province of Elsewhere, but as far as the purposes of this game, it faces off into nowhere. The gates themselves are the bare minimum. Little more than holes in the wall. Hardly any defenses. Yeah, they have towers on each side, but again, those towers are the bare minimum. This is the fundamental problem with the walls and all the defenses of Leyawiin. They're generic. They're just there. They don't communicate anything about the city, what they're defending, and why they'd want to defend it. Going back to Anvil, all of the city's defenses, their walls, their towers, the castle, tell us what's the city's priority, what they want to defend. The port. Even Bravil, and ignoring all the silly dilapidation, its defenses have a very clear message. The heavily fortified main gate and water gates, strategically placed towers, they're saying, you aren't messing with our docks. Leyawiin's generic walls and randomly placed towers doesn't tell us anything unique about the city, doesn't tell us what they value, what they're trying to defend. Again, they come off as more of an afterthought. Then there's the materiality of the walls. Leyawiin is located in a delta. Lots of mud, not a whole lot of stone. They'd have to import the stone to make the masonry walls, which would make sense if the site had some importance, like maybe being a port or a strategic military site. But it not being either one, it raises the question, why did they go through all the effort to bring in the stone to build the walls, and then make these bland, generic walls that barely defend the city? Once you import the stone, you then have to build on this site, which happens to be located in a delta. Lots of deep mud and regular seasonal flooding. Both have to be taken into account, which requires specialized foundations and specialized walls. Again, the architecture fits its environment. These walls are just generic Cyrodiil walls. They don't match their environment. Wait a minute. I've seen this stable before. It's identical to the one outside of Imperial City. It must be a chain. But somehow, this stable is in better shape than the one outside of the capital. Y'all can check out my Introduction to Oblivion Architecture video where I go into depth on the issues with this building. And seeing how this is the exact same building, all of that applies. Moving Imperial City stables next to Leyawiin adds to its problems because Leyawiin is located in a hot, humid, damp, swampy environment, kind of like Florida. First and the most obvious, the building has no windows. It would be unlivable. You want an example of what it would be like? Go hang out in a barn loft on a hot summer sunny day. Little advice though, bring lots of water. And then there are the boards. Now I'm not going to keep harping on how in a medieval setting they would be an anachronism. Assuming you have them in a hot, humid, damp climate, you'd have to regularly maintain them, like whitewashing or painting them. Otherwise, they would be covered in moss, mold, and mildew in no time, particularly seeing how with no windows, you have no ventilation. And then there are those stone walls. The interiors would sweat condensation like nobody's business. Bethesda is using boards to symbolize poverty. So half the building is made out of poor people stuff, and the other half of the building is built from expensive imported luxury goods. The stone used in the stable walls is a different stone than the one that's used in the city's walls, and the masonry is different. So I guess when they decided to build the stables, they imported their own stone and their own masons. Maybe it is a franchise after all. The silly thing is, the stables get the form of the stables, right? In this type of environment, this type of weather, you'd want a good roof that would keep the weather off the animals so they could dry off, but you'd want it to be as open as possible to get as much air movement as possible. See my earlier comments about the silliness of the boards and stone walls. And in this type of environment, you would never let the shingles get into this condition. It undermines the very reason you'd have a barn in the first place. Plus, it would allow the building to rot really fast in this hot, humid weather. Finally, the rock has returned to Leyawiin. Whoops, wrong video. But we finally got into the city. Right off the bat, we have a problem. All over the city are these pools of foul, stagnant water. Why? First off, if you have a water table in Leyawiin that is so high that you have standing pools of water, you can't have an undercroft in the cathedral. It would flood. Having large pools of stagnant water all over the city would cause a mosquito problem. You'd have issues with typhus, cholera, and all sorts of other nasty diseases. And let's be perfectly honest here. This is a city. All cities have their unsavory elements. So how often would you find bodies floating in this? And these open pools of water would contaminate your wells. Where would you get drinking water? This is another one of those, the more you think about it, the sillier it gets. There is absolutely no reason these should be existing within the city. Medieval people knew how to drain wetlands. England was doing it with the Fens, and look what the Dutch did. I go back to these generic walls. How were they built in standing water in the first place, and why are they still standing without any specialized foundations? And then there's the issue with the streets. If this area is so wet and so muddy, you have standing pools of water, how did they build the streets in the first place? Why aren't they just sinking into the ground? There's no excuse for this, because medieval people knew how to build cities at the mouth of rivers in wet, muddy deltas with high water tables. Venice, anyone? Y'all should be picking up on a theme here. Bethesda decided they wanted to put a city in a hot, humid, swampy environment. But instead of designing the city to fit that environment, they just took a city from other parts of Cyrodiil and plopped it down in this environment. Unfortunately, the architecture is optimized for a very different climate. I'll start with the good, because it's not all bad. The first thing y'all should notice is that most buildings in Leyawiin are on a plinth, a raised stone platform. These plinths perform two important functions. First, they raise the building up off the ground, a good thing in a wet environment with a high water table. Second, the plinths act as a raft. They spread the load out over a wider area, allowing the building to float on top of the mud. All the buildings in town have steep roofs, which is a good thing in an environment with a lot of rain. It allows the water to run off quickly, lets the roofs dry out whenever the rain does stop. All the buildings have wood shingles, which fits the environment. Again, they work well to keep the rain out of the building, and wood would be readily available in a hot, wet climate. The buildings are post and beam construction with wattle and daub infill. We see this building technique all over Cyrodiil, so that's not a problem. And the materiality fits the environment. It's a swamp. We'd expect to find lots of wood for the structure and the wattle, and there's mud everywhere, which would make a good base for the daub. The issue isn't the materiality, it's how the materials that are used that causes all sorts of problems. Now for the bad. You have these buildings where the upper floors step out, like Skingrad. This doesn't make sense for two reasons. First off, you do this where you have very small city lots. You're trying to maximize space in a crowded environment. Here in Leyawiin, you're not crowded. You have lots of space. There's no need to do this. You say, well, they don't need to do it. They just like it. So they do it because they can. Well, that gets to the second issue. They can't do it. It goes back to that foundation. A quick structural engineering break. Gravity pushes down on buildings, but it doesn't push evenly because different parts of a building weigh differently, causing the building to want to rotate. That's the purpose of the foundation, to keep it from rotating. What happens when your foundation is a raft floating across the surface? And what happens if your building goes up and then out, extending past the end of that raft? That part that extends out past the end of the raft becomes a lever. And what's the point of a lever? It makes it easy to rotate things. Give me a big enough lever and I can move the earth. Best case scenario, you're going to have uneven settling. Worst case scenario, you're going to have the whole building, raft and all, go boop, or more realistically, The next issue are these stone half walls on the ground floors of some of the buildings. These are imported materials being used in the more affluent houses. Maybe they're status symbols. So the material in of itself isn't the issue. It's how they're used. This is the issue with all the materials being used in Leyawiin. It isn't that they are inappropriate in of themselves, it's how they're used. Leyawiin is in a hot, humid, swampy environment. The number one thing you need, both for livability, health, and for the longevity of the building, is air movement. These buildings look like they come from Northern Europe, which prioritizes keeping air out and heat in. In a hot, humid, swampy environment, you want the exact opposite. Heat out, air movement through the building. The problem extends to the building's details as well. Every single one of these projections and overhangs would allow water to collect and pool, which would give water the opportunity to infiltrate your building. Water is the number one enemy of architecture. The last thing you want is for water to be infiltrating into your building. Rot. And in a hot, humid, damp environment, wood rots faster than you can imagine. I keep talking about how Bethesda's philosophical and aesthetic choices keep causing unnecessary problems with their world building, specifically their insistence on showing everywhere in Cyrodiil as being dilapidated and run down. Leyawiin is a prime example of this. In this particular environment, hot, humid, and damp, you can't afford to allow your buildings to become dilapidated. Why? Mold. Y'all know certain molds get into your building, they kill you. You would have to maintain your buildings to a certain level just so that people survive. You say, well, it's just the poor people. They don't have any choice. They got to take what they can get. Yeah, that argument would carry some weight if it was only the poor houses that were shown to be dilapidated. The reason why you would paint or whitewash a building is more than just decorative. First off, it seals the wall, preventing water and other icky things from coming into your building. And two, it acts as an antibacterial agent, preventing those icky things from growing on your wall in the first place. In an environment that would cause your buildings to deteriorate at an unusually fast rate, you would be forced to maintain them regularly just to make sure they were usable for as long as possible. In this type of environment, the number one thing you would maintain is your roof. You would never allow it to get to the point where it had sags and dips, and you would definitely never nail horizontal boards across the top of the roof on top of the shingles. All these things allow water to pool. Again, infiltration. All the other cities that I've critiqued in Oblivion and the other ones I've yet to analyze, they fit their environments pretty well. All the other cities have a reason to exist within their geography and the greater context of Cyrodiil, and their materiality reinforces their reason to exist and fits their local environment. Leyawiin, on the other hand, not only does it not have a reason to exist, it actively defies our expectations of why we think it should exist. And this materiality is completely inappropriate for its environment. Now, I got to say, I like Oblivion. I think its world building is pretty good, and I think its architecture is pretty good as well. You think I'm being a little harsh? Wait till you hear me critique a game I think is bad. At any rate, I hope I've given you all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. While you're at it, why don't you like this video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time, and feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.